broadcast through the web, so we're utilizing some technology this morning, so that's exciting as well. So again, good morning. My name is Jennifer Atkins. I'm the Compensation Manager in UHR. I've been here about a year, and so I've been working behind the scenes pretty heavily over the last year on FLSA, so I'm excited this morning to provide you an update. I'm sure many of you have heard about the new regulations that have been issued, so I'm going to touch briefly on that. But the point this morning of this session is really to go over FLSA 101. What are the basics, and kind of level set everyone again, all HR practitioners, to the regulation and what you should be looking for and what you should know on the basics. So, what is the Fair Labor Standards Act? And again, sometimes people call it FLSA, sometimes people call it FLISA. It was an act established in 1938, and the purpose of it is to establish regulations around the minimum wage rates, payroll and timekeeping, youth employment, and most importantly for us, overtime pay rules. And these regulations are enforced and crafted by the Department of Labor. So a lot of times when you read the issuance, you can go directly to DOL and see that information on their website. So what does it cover when we talk about overtime? As we go through and explore different jobs as they're written, you do examine whether or not a job will be exempt, which means will it earn overtime or will it not? So our non-exempt employees, all of them are eligible for overtime. And what that means is that if they work more than 40 hours, that needs to be paid at time and a half. So how is it determined whether someone's exempt from overtime, meaning that they don't earn it, or they're non-exempt, which means they do? There are three basic areas that are part of the test, and they are the base salary, or the threshold amount that's been established by the Department of Labor. Also salaried, meaning are they paid salaried rather than hourly? And the last one's around job duties. So these are the three main areas that we're going to talk about today as I go through the presentation. So as we talk about what does exempt mean and what does non-exempt mean, here's a brief overview of how you can delineate the two. And a lot of times employees ask the question, well, how do I know what I am? And it's very important that they know, it's very important that managers know. So if employees are asking, they can contact the HR Service Center and find out what they are. Most employees know as well based on whether they're required to complete a timesheet and log their hours. And so as an overview, if we're talking about exempt, these are employees that are not subject to the minimum wage overtime timekeeping requirements of the Act because they meet those threshold requirements, they are salaried, they meet the job duties. And so under the job duties, what does that mean? What are the type of things that you're looking for? Well, typically exempt positions have executive, administrative, professional responsibilities. They typically work autonomously. They regularly exercise their own discretion and judgment within a position. And they have the authority typically over supervisory duties. So things like hiring and firing and being able to manage other employees. So those are just some of the rules behind determining the exempt. For non-exempt employees, again, these are the ones that do earn overtime, so they're logging their hours. They are subject to the regulations, and the positions do need to maintain accurate timekeeping as they log their hours for the week. So again, it's really important that an employee that's non-exempt, that they log all hours worked, and we're going to talk a little bit about what that means in the next slide. So the overtime pay rules that were most recently issued that everyone keeps talking about, and I keep on getting a lot of questions, how did this all play out and how did we land where we are today? So in 2014, President Obama decided that he wanted to really make this an initiative, so he challenged the Department of Labor to come up with a way to update FLSA regulations. So those proposed regulations were issued back in July 2015, and that's really where our behind-the-scenes work started. And the primary change that was noted was one of the items that I listed previous slide, and that was to the salary threshold. There was a significant change, and I'm going to show you what that means as well. And so while that preliminary information was released, we started doing some background work to say, how will this impact our workforce? What are we guessing it will look like? So that's when we really started our analytics. Did a lot of reach out regarding the positions, just ensuring that employees are in the correct jobs, having departments and schools look at their employees to make sure that those positions were correct. Because again, tying back to the prior slides, it's important that the job describes accurately what the employee is doing so that we can determine whether or not they're exempt or non-exempt based on the type of duties. And if you got a mismatch in how you're describing them versus what they're actually doing, you'll run into some challenges there. So it's really important that you make sure that that job does accurately describe. So that type of work went on as well. So while we were waiting anxiously, we finally received the final regulations May 2016, and the effective date that they provided for these new regulations will be December 1st, 2016, and people across the nation let out a sigh of relief about this because it does give us some time to really refine what our plan of action is and how we'll address the new regulations. So what does it mean? So essentially, this slide shows you exactly a side-by-side on what the prior state was or what currently we're operating under, because remember, these regulations don't go in effect until December. So one of the first tests, again, back to that other slide, the threshold amount. That was a big change. You can see right now it's at $455 a week or $23,660 a year. And so now it's going to change up in December 1st, 2016 to $913 a week or $47,476 a year. So you can see that jump was pretty significant, which is why everyone, again, across the nation was really curious on to how this would finally play out. So we were excited to finally see that. Another piece of that threshold test that I referred to earlier, right now it's been frozen. And the last update to the threshold amount had occurred quite some time ago, and in fact the regulations were last really looked at in 2004. So we've had a significant time period that the regulations have kind of been set frozen. So what's going to happen under the new regulations that have been issued is that beginning in January 2020, the salary threshold is going to be updated every 3 years. So that's kind of interesting for us because that means we're going to be chasing a number. And there's some guesses on what that number may be, but right now we'll just have a plan of action that we're going to use the methodology that we've explored thus far, and I'm going to share with you to continue to update that. But that was a significant change as well because, again, when you're moving from a frozen state for about 12 years, to now having an update every 3 years, that's something that employers really have to think about how they'll address, and it's a significant change. Another one of the tests around salary amounts was around the highly compensated worker. And so that test before was set at $100,000. It's kind of the bright white line of exemption is what they've referred to it as. That salary test now has moved up to $134,004. Again, gotta love these numbers because they're so kind of random. But that again is another significant shift, and it's kind of that bright white line test of whether a person is meeting the exemption. And then last but not least, before, bonuses were not allowed to be included when looking at the threshold amounts and whether someone is meeting the exemption criteria. But now they do. They're allowing up to 10% of the minimum salary to be met by non-discretionary bonuses. And the interesting piece about this is that they've put in a caveat of them being paid at least quarterly. So that's also kind of interesting. But again, that's a shift from where we were before as far as allowing that. So you can see from our current state to where we're moving in December, there's going to be some changes. And I think the most obvious one has been around the threshold amount. The nice part is the duties didn't change. So you'll notice those aren't on the slide deck here. So the information I referred to on the prior slide about some of those autonomy and being able to have supervisory discretion and things of those nature, those all still exist, and those weren't altered by the Department of Labor. So those will stay the same, but these are the main changes to the regulations. So again, here are some of the examples of the job duties tests that didn't change. There are various categories that fall under the job duties test typically executive, professional, administrative. There are certain computer roles for computer professionals, and then outside sales, and all of these are the same as they were before. There is a unique qualifier that they've put in around the administrative portion, and for us it's the academic administrative professionals. They put in a caveat in there that says that ultimately those individuals can remain exempt if they make at least the threshold of the entry teacher salary. So that was a little bit of a clarification to the already administrative job duties test. And so again, that's another area that we're looking along with our general counsel on how that can be applied to us. It was nice to have that higher education specialty recognized in the new regulations. So that was very helpful. So we've talked about pretty much up to this point everything around exempt and what makes an employee exempt and when they don't earn overtime. But that still remains our population that we have that has non-exempt employees in their departments or schools. So here's just some reminders around non-exempt. And again, these are all people that don't meet that threshold amount. They're people that don't meet within their job duties, the job duties test. They're people that are paid hourly rather than salaried. So these folks, they are not impacted by the new regulations. So if before they were non-exempt, they were earning hourly pay. These employees are not impacted by the new regulations. They'll continue to be non-exempt. It's very important, as a reminder, that those employees that are non-exempt or hourly, that they maintain true and accurate time records. Again, it's very important because anytime they exceed that 40 hours, they need to be paid at time and a half. So if they're not recording those hours, it could be an issue where they're earning extra pay that they aren't being provided. So it's just an important reminder. One of the trickiest parts about logging hours comes around when people are doing extra work, and whether that be through an iPhone or whether they're working those extra meal breaks, or maybe they're traveling during the day from one meeting and then they're going to a conference. Those are really important to note for non-exempt workers because all of that is included in work time. So if they're continuing to work through a meal time, that would be counting as their work. So it's really important that those hours are logged in actual time. And again, that's because anything over 40 needs to be paid at time and a half. And employees, essentially, we want to encourage them to always report that time. Kind of the flip side of this is that any unauthorized work still does need to be paid. Of course, that employee can be reprimanded or spoken to about how to log correctly their hours, but it's really important that we do accurately log those so that they can be paid correctly. So we always want the timesheets to be accurate. So what's our plan overall for addressing both of these populations? Because again, we have our non-exempt folks that really need to make sure they're logging those hours, and then we have our exempt employees, and now kind of those lines between the two are being reevaluated once again. So at this point, we've been doing a lot of planning. Again, we're looking at those jobs because the job description is really what drives whether an employee is going to be exempt or non-exempt. So it's very important that they're accurate. We're also looking at our job titles. So when we had the Job Family Project several years ago, a big initiative was undertaken to make sure that everyone was mapped correctly to jobs, and we want to do that again. We want to make sure that those titles that are being used and the jobs that are being used accurately describe the work. So we're doing that right now. We're also looking with our attorneys, as I mentioned, to make sure that we're reading the new regulations correctly. There's been a series of webinars that have been put on by DOL that we've continued to attend. There's some sessions that have been put on by attorney groups and by Coupa, and all of these things are helping shape our plan of action as we move forward. And so again, this phase where we're at in June is really the planning phase so that we can figure out, again, let's truly define and accurately define our non-exempt and exempt work and make sure that we're in alignment with the new regulations. So we anticipate through July that we'll be doing a lot of reach out around those job descriptions and making sure the alignment's correct. We'll continue to do more analysis around our course of action of what we plan to do. And the reality is, more than likely, we will need to push up some of the employees' pay in order to keep them at the exempt level. There may be other jobs that we'll be looking at that don't meet the new requirements of the new regulation, and those will be altered to non-exempt. We do expect on our preliminary analysis that we've done thus far that those employees impacted in that group that might be moving from exempt to non-exempt would be pretty small for us. But there still is that possible scenario, and that could be a course of action. So through July, we're going to continue with the refinement of that. And then in August is where we will really buckle down to make sure that the job slotting and that the jobs are accurate. So as we look at those populations that are impacted either way or maybe not at all, that people are correctly in there. And we'll use that as an opportunity of a re-education of what does it mean around the job description? You know, how do you accurately craft a job description? What type of things should really be included in there? And doing an educational opportunity around the slotting and job descriptions. And then come September, that's when we really expect to have some decisions made from leadership around our final course of action. Again, which of those jobs have been impacted by the new regulations and what does that look like? And then October, our plan is to communicate that out. So we'll communicate that to the managers, we'll communicate that to the employees so that those impacted know exactly what to expect. And we'll also provide some educational opportunities because again, as we talk about maybe a manager that always had exempt employees now has some non-exempt employees, we need to educate them on some of these things that we're talking about, the accurate timekeeping and things of those nature. So that's certainly recognized. And those employees will also need to be logging time, whereas maybe before they never did that. They only logged their leave. So we expect October to be a really big communication time period so everyone's on the same page. And then implementation would occur in November. The last pay period in November, I believe, encompasses the December 1st regulation, which is what we need to meet. So that would be the actual implementation time so that we can make sure that we address the regulations in a timely manner. So that's kind of our plan. So now's the fun part, because I know just to listen to me babble for quite some time can be a little bit draining. So I've incorporated a little trivia, and if you know me, if you swing by my office, I have a trivia calendar. So every day, and my friend Joe here, we practice our trivia. So I have a couple giveaways. So I know it's going to be a competitive audience here. I know that. But we're going to do it by whoever can stand up and answer first. All right, so my first trivia question ties back to what I shared with you on one of the earlier slides about the regulations. And when the first issuance of the regulations, it was in 1938. So who was the president in 1938?
FDR.
Good job. There you go. So just to up the ante a little bit, we do have the Who's Well gifts that are going to be given out today. So good job. That is correct. So under FDR, these were when the first regulations were originally issued. And so again, they've been around for a while, but there's been some regular adjustments to that. So the second question to you, I mentioned earlier that we're just now getting ready to have another update to the regulations. But prior to this, when was the last update done?
2004.
Good job. Indeed it was. That's correct. And so in 2004, they did a lot of work, not only to the threshold, but around the definitions of the job duties and clarifications of that. So it's kind of interesting that in 2016, they didn't do many changes around the job duties. They just offered some additional clarification. All right, another question. Again, this is testing your applicable knowledge and a new change for us too that just happened a couple weeks ago. So my question is, do exempt UVA employees need to complete and submit their timesheets?
Yes. No.
No.
You want to refine your answer a little bit?
Expand.
No, we do not have to.
Unless
Unless I have vacation time I need to log.
Or volunteer.
Oh, come on now.
Or compound.
All right, so you're going to be working out now.
I have to use my compound earned if I have to use it, so I still have to go on vacation or sick time, right? That's a lot of
Yeah, so I'm sure everyone enjoyed those, it was like, we're all like, yeah, no needing to submit that blank timesheet anymore. That was pretty exciting, at least I was excited, I don't know. Okay, so another interesting piece of this law that is kind of obscure, but there was actually a provision that was issued back in 2004 again, that employers are able to use to minimize the impact of improper deductions from an exempt employee's salary. So essentially, if you have an employee that is exempt and you realize maybe that there were some incorrect deductions from their check, or if they should be perhaps non-exempt and that correction needs to take place, there is a permitted brief time period that the employer has the opportunity to make any corrections to these improper deductions. And the rules around that is that you have to clearly communicate in policy the prohibition of improper pay deductions. You have to reimburse employees for any of those deductions. And finally, you have to make a good faith effort that you are in future FLSA compliance with these. So that's a special piece of the FLSA provision, and I'm curious to see this kind of an advanced question. So I've got an advanced trivia win here, and so what is that called when an employer has the opportunity to make corrections to the improper deductions if they happen to take place that can supersede, or as long as they didn't make the due diligence to make the correction? What is that called? Who said it? Yay! Good job! Yeah, it's called safe harbor. And so again, as we move under these regulations, we want to get it right, obviously. But there is a safe harbor clause in there that says, that you really need to do your due diligence. You need to make sure that the deductions are set up correctly and that the pay is correct. But there is a safe harbor law out there to make sure that employers have the protection to get the opportunity to make those corrections. So that's good. Okay, and then I do have another, last but not least, more workout. True or false, if a non-exempt employee uses their iPhone over the weekend to check emails and respond voluntarily, does this time have to be paid?
Yes.
No one wants to stand up though for this? Work out. I hear the right answer. Anyone want to say it loud and proud and get a resistance band? Exactly. So that's true. So a lot of managers say, hey, my employee did this on their own. I didn't ask him to do it. Okay, well, if they're non-exempt, again, that's the key. If they're non-exempt and they're working, we need to make sure that they are getting paid correctly for that time. So again, that was one of the earlier slides. That's really important that those hours are logged correctly. Okay, so thanks for playing along with that. Get you guys talking, moving a little bit. Okay, so let's go ahead and open it up now for questions. How am I doing on time? I think I'm doing pretty well.
Jennifer, earlier you noted on one of your screens about if employees have questions to look at their timesheets. What specifically are they looking for?
So I believe let's go back.
Bottom right?
Yeah, so I believe that if they can log in and they see their timesheets, that makes it clear whether or not they are going to be logging hours or not. And so that's one way that employees can check. And then the other piece is if they're unsure, they can call the service center because that'll tell them right away. And typically it's something when they're hired, they'd be told. So I'd anticipate that question to be something that happens early on. At least I pray so, because we want them logging hours as soon as possible for those non-exempt employees.
I was just gonna say, if you go into self-service under My Information, left column, it says if you're exempt or non-exempt. So
Okay.
it's not just when they go into
The time
the
sheet.
time sheet, but it's actually under My Information where you can get, are you also a designated employee for emergency purposes? What's your salary? It's in the My Information segment of self-service.
Okay, so self-service then.
Well, in the timesheet, if it's hours are pre-populated, they're non-exempt.
Right.
If no hours are there, they're exempt.
They're exempt, yeah. So employees should notice that pretty early on, and likewise if they have a job change as well, because that is another opportunity of education. Employees may move from a non-exempt job to an exempt job, or it may be the other way. They might move from exempt to non-exempt position. So it's really important that that discussion takes place on the front end, and that hours can start being tracked as soon as that position begins. Yes.
Jennifer, first I had an unfair advantage because I work at the Miller Center and I know presidential history.
Excellent. It's all right, whatever it takes to win, you know.
Whatever. Second, I want to commend you and Donna Kaufman for the communication throughout this process, conveyed mostly to us through Mike Citro. But we feel like we had an opportunity to ask questions along the way and receive information in a timely manner. That's been very helpful. One of the things that's been confusing to me, and that is going to perpetuate with every 3-year review, is we have, for all of our affected employees, their job duties have not changed and will not change, and yet now all of a sudden they're not exempt. And when we look at the possibility of reclassifying, some do need, another good thing about this is it forces us to look at some things, and yes, there's some that need to be reviewed and reclassified. So that's, without the external prompts, sometimes those things don't happen in a timely manner. But for the rest of the folks, they probably aren't eligible to move up to the next level, and yet their jobs haven't changed, and yet so it becomes a dollar driver, not
Sure.
a duty driver. And so what are we going to do every 3 years when that same thing recurs?
Yeah, that's a great question. So kind of some of the background for those that may not have been as heavily involved in some of the work that's been taking place behind the scenes. We started last year, and I want to thank Allison Miller, who's my boss, the director of Total Rewards, of really getting on the front end of this. So when I came to the university last year, we started talking about this law and how it would impact, and that's when we started really looking at the jobs. At that time, the proposed threshold was originally 50,000 and some change. Luckily, they've dropped it down a little bit with the new regulations. But we started looking at what will that look like for our positions, what jobs are impacted, and really starting outreach to go back to departments at that time, and especially over the last few months, to say, are these really the jobs that people are doing? And if so, is this a job that is potentially one that could turn non-exempt based on the salary threshold alone? Because remember, those job duties and the tests around those, you're right, they're not changing, which makes this law even more a little frustrating, I think, for all of us. So what we did is we did a lot of background work with the schools to say, okay, this is what that job looks like. Does it make sense to push the job up to the new threshold to maintain that exemption? And we had some criteria around that. So we looked at things like, what amount of overtime could potentially be earned by this job? And looking at that, does that mean that, we might as well on the front end go ahead and push that up to a job that should be exempt? Or is it a job that maybe is an entry-level professional and not much overtime is typically incurred? And maybe under these new laws, that should be something that's turned to non-exempt. So we shared that information with the schools, and that's the prelim work that we had done prior to the issuance of the law. So now what we're doing is exactly what you described. We're going back and we're saying, okay, now that we know the law and what it will be, how will these jobs, same type of analysis, be impacted? And it's true, the duties aren't changing, but the threshold, again, because that's one of the factors, that's the first factor in a job test to determine whether it's exempt, could drive the job, even though we're doing the same work, to the non-exempt level. And the reality is, while that threshold before was so low at 23,000, that's always been the case. So if someone maybe had the job duties and met the job duties test before but didn't have the salary threshold, they still would have been in the same boat. It just was our salaries continued to grow since that 2004 level. And so for us, it typically wasn't one of the big tests. The new regulations really have flopped that around, that test on the salary threshold has become very important. And it's really interesting as we go through these regulations and hear feedback from other universities and how they're being addressed. There's some places where you think about the cost of living. So Louisiana, West Virginia, Kentucky, 47,476 is pretty high. And so a lot of their population likely will now be non-exempt, which means they may earn overtime, whereas before they might not have. So yes, so I understand what you're saying. It is new. It kind of flips it on its head as that first threshold test being very critical. So we will be in compliance with that. But I think the way that we're addressing it with the schools of, again, being mindful of those jobs and the duties, and then looking at the jobs and how they're described, maybe some of that exempt work can be moved around, can be shifted. We just don't know yet where we're going to land. But we do think, again, from the preliminary analysis and the work that's been done by the schools and the feedback we've received, that it will be a minimal amount of employees that would probably turn from exempt to non-exempt. And the other benefit, like you mentioned, maybe not all, but there are some that are ready to move if they started as a level 1. Maybe they're now ready to move to level 2, and there could be a difference in exemption between a level 1 and a level 2. So the nice part about the university is we're well prepared with our job families, which is great that that work was done a couple years ago. But to your point, I think we do need to refresh and take a new look at that, because through time, people can start doing new activities. There's job evolution. So again, it's going to be a great time now to look back, and that's where that job description education is going to really come into play. Good question. Yes.
So we know we'll have some folks who are currently exempt, young professionals, and they will be turning to non-exempt. And you mentioned there'll be some training for managers. Are you planning to do some training for those employees? Because how they work in their day-to-day work is going to be totally different than what it is today. And we have a lot of flexibility with how they work, and it will totally change dramatically.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, I think the employee portion of this is going to be extremely critical, so that they are well aware of why they're now having to log hours, so that they understand, it is based off the regulations. Here's why your job no longer meets the exemption criteria. And now how do you work? How do you log those hours? And again, there's some tricky pieces. If you've been exempt and you've been coming in on weekends, or you have been using your iPhone or your BlackBerry, do emails, and you can do that at 9 o'clock at night, and now you're realizing, I need to make sure I'm monitoring my hours. There can be a big opportunity for education at that point. So yes, there definitely will need to be education from the employee standpoint as well as the manager. And I think that's the other piece too, is have it be a collaborative effort, so that the manager also is understanding, okay, your employee maybe used to work from 9 to 11 on their iPhone. That's not going to be a part of it now. Or maybe they know there's certain times that are heavy time periods, and that's a week for overtime. But again, those are discussions that will definitely need to be had. And I think especially for the employees that have to start logging hours, we definitely need to utilize that opportunity to do a refresher on what does it mean to be non-exempt. Good point. And that's a nice part too about these regulations being so far in advance. Originally, some of the talk was that we'd only have 60 days to kind of get all this done. And so we were very excited when the regulations were issued that we have until December, because that gives us a lot of time to have these sort of educational and methodical ways to address the new regulations.
And how do the non-regular faculty and like GTA appointments fit within the Fair Labor Standards Act?
So the teaching exemption still applies. So there wasn't an alteration to that. So that's fantastic. There's been some additional opportunity of refinement around like coaches, for example, and whether or not they have teaching responsibilities. So that's still part of the exemption, and that will remain. So that we were breathing a sigh of relief around faculty, because the teaching exemption was not changed, and that was really great.
So between now and implementation, what is your advice for us to give to hiring managers who might be bringing people in at salaries that are either going to have to bump up or exempt level things that might have to be bumped down? Because that's a large gap, and with the knowledge we have, you don't want to cause expenses to the future.
Yes, absolutely. So what we'll be doing over the next month, again, the titles and the jobs impacted are still being refined at this point. So for us to try to share with the department, like, this for sure is, you need to do this. We're not there yet. But as you can see by the timeline, we anticipate probably by August that we'll have a clear understanding of which of those titles that were impacted. We'll have a toolkit to be able to show which jobs need to be considered under that new world and how that will look. So for planning purposes, people can know how to best address kind of that time gap that you're referring to. So I anticipate for HR practitioners that information to be more in the August, September timeframe once we nail those down. And again, part of this too, I'm a Wahoo, so I graduated from UVA, and I've been very proud at the opportunities we've been given as far as the planning purposes, but to partner with general counsel. And so know that too, that all of the work that we're doing is being reviewed by general counsel, and they've been fantastic in regards to giving us advice. So again, once we are able to communicate those titles, we have the background as to why they were determined to be one way or another. And so that again is an opportunity for the HR practitioner to directly communicate that information as well, so that everyone's comfortable with what's being released. So I've been very proud of the university and just the thoughtfulness that's gone into such a huge regulatory change.
When do you anticipate knowing what the impact is going to be in terms of across the university staff?
So I think once we get the final critical business decisions in September, we'll know those final financial impacts. We have a general idea right now. President Sullivan was a part of a lot of the action up in DC prior to the regulations being issued, sharing with them the enormous impact that could potentially happen around overtime cost or having to bump up employees. So we have a general idea, but we'll know, final numbers once those business decisions are made by leadership on which specific jobs will move. We'll know the specific financial impact.
Has there been any talk about adjusting it in the benefits side of things, if there was an impact?
We haven't, and just as another aside to this, if there is an impacted employee that's moving from exempt down to non-exempt, as you may know, there's a difference in retirement choices. They may have chosen the ORP versus going to VRS. They will be grandfathered, so there won't be an impact to those employees as far as benefits, but we understand moving forward there could be different choices for those job titles if they've moved from an exempt to non-exempt. So from that standpoint, we've been looking at that.
Because right now there isn't, correct? I mean, if you're a university staff, the benefits that are offered to you, whether you're exempt or non-exempt, are consistent, correct?
Correct. However, in general, it follows the ONA and the M&P. So office administrative is typically non-exempt, and the managerial and professional is typically exempt. And so as you move between the two of those, there could be an impact to benefit choice on whether you're offered the ORP and VRS. There could be, right. So just again, so employees are not impacted by that, and you can know that in advance. Those employees, if they were to move from one to the other, they still can maintain whatever their original retirement choice was. So again, that it minimizes the impact to the employee.
I was just curious with several of the federal funding agencies. So one of them, when you talk about higher ed and the sort of positions that could be impacted, the professional research staff on grants. Have you? I know the NIH was looking at updating some of their information and some of their budget type stuff on the basis of this. Have you seen anything else from that for people who kind of sit in that space to be thinking about or looking at for that element of the, I'm assuming that gets built into the critical business decisions on impact and where do we get money if they're looking for the cost?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's been some speak from NIH about how they're going to kick up some funding, and we just don't know what that's going to look like. It looked like originally from some of their commentary in the beginning that they understood that and recognized the new law would have an impact on them. And so we don't know exactly what that will look like, but we anticipate in the coming months that we will. Another question I'm surprised I haven't gotten yet, but is around classified employees and DHRM. And so those employees we do have mapped to UVA job titles. So we have gotten authorization from DHRM, and kind of their advice at this point is to be that those exemption criteria will be managed at the local level, which we already do. So classified employees will follow whatever our guidance is on those titling. But as far as grants and things like that, we just don't know if people will end up stepping up, and that's going to be part of the critical business decisions. And what seems to be happening, whether it's DHRM or NIH, they're listening for the refinement of the regulations, and they're slowly trickling in. So one kind of again, I'm a nerd at this point on these things because I love paying attention to the nuances. What I'm seeing a lot in these DOL webinars, and that our attorneys have also kind of keyed in on, before they've always talked about the threshold amount as an annual amount. now as they go through and they talk about the new amounts related to those salary thresholds, they keep on referring to the weekly amount. So there's little nuances, like, so we know the threshold is 47,476 annually, but they keep on referring back to the 913 a week, which for us, again, is great, because if you have an employee that maybe doesn't work the full year, you know that DOL is really going to be looking at that weekly salary for their criteria. So back to your question, not to go completely off topic, but I think that's what's happening in general, is that a lot of people are paying attention to those nuances, and there's small refinements as they go through to say, okay, how can we go with this regulation, be compliant, but really pay attention to the nuances of what DOL expects from it. So that's why I think through time, we'll get a little more filtered information on what people's reactions will be for those funding sources. And then our leadership is looking at that as well. So how will we continue to fund this? We don't know that at this point.
So, does this impact at all the 1,500 hour annually?
Well, it's technically in that people, if they're recording their hours, it's really important they continue to record the hours. It's just, I mean, I think in general, the whole exempt versus non-exempt, that's really what drives that 1,500 hour rule, is around the tracking of hours. So in that way, the tracking of hours are pretty critical, because you're looking at non-exempt work, maybe someone moving from exempt. But again, the 1,500 hours is typically part-time employees. So.
How consistent will we have to be across grounds regarding, I guess what I'm asking is, will supervisors have a choice whether to meet salary threshold or drop their person to non-exempt? Because I guess if you have a admin assistant or research specialist in one school that wants to raise their salary, but another school, they say drop to non-exempt, but it's the same position. Will there be that choice, or do they all have to be the same status?
Great question. Very good question. So that was something that we asked early on, how will we address this as a university? And we decided very early on that we're going to do an all for one, one for all. So the way that our job titling currently works is that if you're using that job title across whichever department, they really need to be doing those duties associated with that job title. So we're going to keep to that. We're going to keep the same methodology. So we won't have a general administrative assistant in one department that's non-exempt and then another one that's exempt. We're not going to do that because it would create an enormous titling issue. And then the tracking of that just based off of a salary requirement would be a nightmare for managers to say, okay, well, this week you're non-exempt, but after merit you'll now be exempt. I mean, just the amount of moves that people make, it just would be impossible to try to manage that. So we are using the one for all methodology, and so if you're using that title, then you need to utilize whatever decision was exercised for that specific title. So again, there'll be guidance issued whether a title is exempt or non-exempt, just as it is right now. So the nice part about this regulation is that while we may be making some changes, we already have in place like the training for if you're non-exempt, what do you do? If you're a manager that has non-exempt employees, what do you do? So all of our kind of structure is already there, and so we're not going to change that structure. If a job title is exempt, it's exempt. If it's not exempt, it's not exempt based on the requirements by DOL. So we're going to keep with that methodology, and we're going to use the titling as it's intended. And so it's very critical, though, that each school and department make sure that they're utilizing that, meeting all the thresholds as that job's been set up. And so we'll have those discussions around, what does it mean for your employee? Do we need to look at this job family for you? Is this the best fit? And all that type of work. But we aren't going to have two separate titles describing the same job and have one be exempt, one non. It goes against what we've already set up and kind of our structure as it's been established. So we're going to keep with that. We're going to stay with that structure. And again, it looks like the impact will be pretty minimal. It's really how do you utilize those job families. So again, I don't think there'll be a significant shift. It'll just be a refinement of how we use those titles. Hot topic? Is everyone sleepy from the Cavs win last night? I mean, I'm a huge LeBron fan, so I don't know. I was up pretty late. All right, well, as we continue, I'm sure you will likely come up with some thoughts or questions, and I certainly welcome those. Email is very easy for me to respond to, so I'm happy to do so. Here's my contact information for you. And I appreciate your time this morning. I know it's a lot of information and it's complex, and so I just want you to know this is just the beginning of this opportunity to learn more about FLSA. And the other thing I wanted to mention briefly is that we will be having another opportunity for kind of an FLSA 201. We are partnering with our attorney to do that session. We'll have someone from the Attorney General's office coming. We anticipate that to be July 26th, so if you want to pencil that in, it'll likely be in that. And what we'll cover there is not only the new regulations, but also talk about an independent contractor versus employee. Like, how do you tell the difference? And so that'll be kind of a 201 FLSA. So you may get tired of hearing from me over the next couple months, but I'm just excited to be here this morning to start the conversation because really, again, we have 6 months until we're going to land where we need to. So I'm excited that so many people have asked such great questions and have participated thus far. So, yes.
I got one quick question.
Great.
Do you anticipate the duties test changing in any next couple of years, or?
I don't anticipate that, but I think they could offer refinement because that's kind of what they did now. Again, I hate to pick on Brett, but we paid close attention in athletics to how they were treating the coaches, and we're pretty excited to see how they define that. And so I think they'll continue to do that. Again, with the academic professional, that was interesting, but it wasn't a shift necessarily. It was just a refinement. So I think we'll continue to see those refinements over the 3 years. But you never know. I mean, no one expected this. So we'll just keep our finger on the pulse of that to figure it out. All right, I have an evaluation sheet I'm going to pass out. And then I'm going to turn it back over to Ellen. Thank you.
Thank you.
So it's about 10 minutes to 11. We'd like to have everybody take some time to fill out an evaluation sheet. If you could just leave them turned over on one of the tables on either side. If anyone needs to take a break before we start the circle meeting at 11, if you go out this door to the right and then to the left, the restrooms are there. There are drinking fountains over here. So we appreciate everybody coming, and we'll see you start again in about 10 minutes.
Thank you.